Thank you very much for inviting me and for making me so welcome here. I'm going to try and sit down, otherwise you won't be able to hear me because I lost my voice earlier in the week, but it feels very unnatural to sit down and present, so I normally jump around a bit, which might be a good thing, as I think we're all a little tired after our lovely lunch. Thank you so much. What I want to talk about is really to talk about the topic of today, which is about improving social justice or overcoming inequality, with a particular focus on students from different groups. And I particularly want to change part of what we've been talking about, and I want to argue that it's not just about who gets into higher education, which is what the preceding discussions have been about, but it's also about who stays in higher education and completes their degrees. There's another part of the conversation which I haven't really developed in this paper, which is about where they go afterwards, which kind of relates to the conversation we were just having about who gets into which subjects and then into which professions and those sorts of things. But what I really want to do today is to talk about student success, so continuation and completion of their degrees in higher education, and particularly to focus on England. So you can see my little diagram there, my little map of the UK. And it is really important, which Claire talked about, the English policy is now hugely different to the rest of the UK. So everything, unless I say otherwise, is very much about England rather than the rest of the UK. So, as I say, the argument I want to make is it's about retention and completion as well as getting in, and just to provide that kind of context, that there's a target for about 40% of young people to have completed a higher education qualification, and I'm speculating that this conference is partly inspired by the fact that Portugal has got quite a long way to go to achieve that target, and there's quite a bit of evidence, or not evidence, but policy commitment across Europe that we need to work on completion as well as access. And this perhaps builds on much of the work of Vincent Tinto, who of course is one of the leading theorists on student persistence and success in higher education. So across the higher education area, since about, particularly it started with the London Communiqué, there's lots of kind of comments about the fact that simply getting into higher education is not enough. And that was really shown by the US presentation that David gave us, that a lot of students don't necessarily complete. And so the London Communiqué kind of sets this idea that access is not enough, it's about completion as well. And then that's really reflected in various other communiqué. And the Yerevan Communiqué kind of talks about the importance of inclusive learning and teaching, and that's very much where a lot of my research goes, and I'll talk about later on. And then that's reiterated in the most recent meeting of the higher education ministers across Europe. I'm probably not going to talk about all those comments, but I just want to move on, really. So if we're talking about success in higher education, not just getting into higher education, it's surprising how little research there is about it across Europe. So in 2013, a former colleague of mine undertook a piece of work for the European Commission looking at student success in higher education. And what you see in that is that there's a limited amount of research on it. So then in 2005, I was involved in a study with CHEPS and NIFU, actually, and we were looking at what's called dropout, which is a term I generally like to avoid, dropout from higher education and completion in higher education across Europe. And this was perhaps the first time, really, that retention and student completion and success have been looked at across Europe. So in that sense, it's quite a significant piece of work. But the remit was really about looking at national approaches. So that's partly what I want to talk about today, around the national approaches that countries have, to improve student retention and success, but also how national policy contexts can influence the institutional actions. Because what I want to go on to demonstrate is that much of the work to improve student retention and success has to take place at the institutional level. And what I want to argue is that institutions themselves need to change rather than just thinking about changing students. So we really need to think about ourselves as the providers of higher education and what we need to do differently, because if we've simply been used to having very traditional cohorts of students coming in, then we've perhaps been operating, to kind of use ideas from Bourdieu, been operating in ways which are familiar to certain types of students and exclude other types of students. So in this European project, we looked at 35 higher education institutions. In fact, Iceland was the 36th country which we found it not possible to include, which may be due to its very small size, as Piers has talked about. The first challenge in undertaking this is one of the many challenges in undertaking comparative research, was around definitions. So one of the first surveys we did with higher education experts across the 35 participating countries was to ask them what defining success in higher education looked like. Interestingly, the most popular answer was around employment, but the European Commission decided that that wasn't something that we were allowed to talk about because we were supposed to look at retention and dropout and not about employment. That was being looked at elsewhere within the Commission. So in terms of actual kind of success within higher education, we looked at the definitions of completion, so whether students have actually completed their degree, which was probably the most popular definition, but also time to degree becomes really important. Piers talked about the idea that it might take sort of 5 or 7 years to complete, whereas in the UK, most students, the majority of students, will complete their degree in 3 years if they're studying full-time. So time to completion is an important indicator as well. And then the third sort of area that we were looking at was around retention. So in other words, it's a kind of an intermediate measure so that students still continue from 1 year of study into their next year of study and so on and so forth. But what comes across is what we find initially then is that there's a lack of shared definition of study success. So I'll explain in due course what we mean by study success in England, but I guess you may well have different definitions in Portugal, or indeed you might not have shared definitions. But I want to draw a little bit on the literature to talk about the factors that contribute to study success, however you define it in your different contexts, and kind of strangely, however it's defined, the same factors seem to be important. So I want to suggest that we use what I've called here a multidimensional or a layered approach to understanding student success. So this really summarises the findings that I want to kind of go through from the literature. You're going to have a whistle-stop tour of a lot of stuff in 45 minutes. You can have the slides afterwards in the paper. The first area to talk about is around individual students, and there's quite a bit of research around student demographics and dispositions. And then the second area is around institutions, around higher education providers, and particularly about their commitment, their policies and their practices. And the third area of the literature review is really around looking at the national context, the policies and enablers that take place. So to pick up that individual level, the student level, the research from across different European countries, taken place within individual European countries, tends to identify that there are certain demographics and dispositions which are associated with lower rates of success. They're also generally associated with lower rates of participation in higher education. So things like, we've already heard quite a bit about socioeconomic status, however that's defined in different countries, whether that's income in the US or whether it's around class in England and so on and so forth. There are factors about male students. Male students tend to have less good rates of completion in higher education, although in some countries, minority genders in subjects that are dominated by one gender also seem to have lower rates of success. So men who do go into teaching are less likely to stay the course, for example, or women who go into computer science and so on and so forth. Ethnic minorities have lower rates of completion. Older students. There's also there's a lot of evidence around academic achievements, so your school qualifications helping to determine whether or not you're successful in higher education. And then there's quite a lot of evidence around motivation, so whether you're interested and kind of motivated to study and the expected benefits you expect, the benefits you expect to receive from your higher education. So all of these are kind of issues which are seen to determine who stays and who leaves higher education. But for me, these are kind of the least interesting parts of it, because generally as a higher education institution, we have the students we have. We only have a certain amount of choice around who they are. So my own institution could say, well, we want better students, ones who don't have those characteristics. But we don't always have those choices, that we're in a competitive market. And although we admit students, we only have limited options around doing that. So what most of the research evidence shows, can you give me me some water. What most of the research evidence shows is that it's about the institution. The institution is very influential in terms of who's successful in higher education. Thank you. And this seems to be connected to institutional mission and commitment. So a lot of the work's shown that you have to have that senior level and whole institution commitment to improving success. But other evidence points to the importance of providing potential students with information and allowing them to make good decisions, allowing students or enabling students to make good decisions and match with the subjects that they study. So in England, for example, computer science has the lowest rates of completion, and that's often about students not understanding what computer science is because they think it's about IT and things like that, rather than about computer programming because it's not a subject they've studied previously. So arguably, if you improve their understanding of the subject and how it kind of matches with their aspirations of their future selves. So that's something that, for example, in the Netherlands, they've been doing a lot of work on, is matching students better. But you've also got issues around selection and open access. So as I say, in the English context, we're able to select our students, and in some senses we have not that much choice, but it does mean that there's an entry or a minimum level of academic qualifications, whereas in other countries like Italy there's much more open access, and certainly Poland in this study was arguing that students leaving higher education is part of the quality assurance, that you need to weed out the less academically able students, whereas in England we would see it as once we've selected our students, we have an obligation to support them to be successful. That doesn't mean they have to pass, but we shouldn't be sort of disadvantaging students unintentionally. Other things that institutions are doing around inclusive learning and teaching, and I'll come back to that. There's a lot of evidence around the importance of kind of social integration and belonging in higher education, which I'll pick up again. But this idea about matching and making a good fit between your own personal aspirations and the culture and the environment of the institution. Other things institutions are doing and come up in the literature around monitoring students' attendance and their progression through the system and developing a whole institution approach. And there's a huge amount of research around what institutions could and should be doing to improve student retention and success, and I'll come back to that in the English context. But what's interesting is very little about what should be happening at the national level in terms of improving student retention and success. But I think, first of all, you have to think about the context. So clearly, issues around the current participation rates and success levels kind of influence how much success there continues to be. So if you only admit a small number of students, then it's more likely that you can nurture them through and they can all be successful. But we currently have a mass higher education system with large numbers of students coming in, so around about 50% of young people. So that, in a way, makes it more difficult to improve retention and completion rates. But different national contexts around access and selectivity, as I've already mentioned, and whether there are alternative options. I think one of the challenges in the UK context more generally is that there are fewer other things that students can do. And of course, the other national level contextual factors are around student tuition fees and financial support, which quite a lot has already been said about today. But then, what are the national policies? And this is really what the European project was looking at. What are the national policies that encourage or enable universities to take responsibility for improving student retention and success? And in the project, we found 170 national policies from across the 35 institutions, which are explicitly trying to improve student retention and success. And these were then grouped into issues around finance, issues around the organisation of higher education, and issues around information and non-financial support for students. And 22 kind of typical policies were identified. So financing is really then about incentivising either institutions to do something or incentivising students. So in countries that are concerned about reducing the time to completion, then there may be financial advantages to completing on time or financial penalties for taking longer than the prescribed period of time, for example. Issues around organisation of teaching and learning is quite broad, but they're around the sort of curricular issues and structural issues within institutions. And I think what's interesting about England is perhaps partly that our higher education expects that students complete in quite a short period of time. It's organised around students completing in 3 or 4 years rather than these much more extended models that we see in other countries. And then a whole range of policies around providing information and supporting students to be successful in higher education. So drawing on this huge project then, the enablers that come out at the national level are the fact that there needs to be a national commitment to improving student retention and success. Arguably, and I think really importantly, there needs to be a shared definition of study success so that everybody is agreed on what they're trying to achieve, otherwise it makes it difficult to do so. There also needs to be policy alignment so that the policies are not pulling in different directions. And I want to argue that to some extent we have that in relation to student retention and success, not necessarily so much in terms of access. And then you need to be able to measure progress. You need to be then able to hold institutions accountable. And I think that's something that we've done quite well in the English context. There are downsides to all of that, but we need to be actually holding institutions accountable and showing the progress that they've made. So what I want to do then is in the next 30 minutes, is to talk through England as a kind of case study around those things. But first of all, I'll just give you some contextual information about England. So there are nearly 2 million students in England, of which 3/4 of those are undergraduate students. And I think one thing that's really distinctive about our country is the fact that the majority of students complete their studies. So 6.3% of young full-time students are still in higher education following the year of entry. And it's 7.6% for all full-time undergraduates. There is quite different data for part-time students, and I think the part-time student population has been decimated and do experience a whole range of different issues. So predominantly this is about younger full-time students who are the majority of students in the English system. As I say, most of our institutions select applicants, but it is important to know that there are few alternatives that young people at 18 can pursue. So arguably people are faced with a fairly stark choice of progressing into an academic higher education course or going into the labour market. So there are probably people in higher education who, if they had an alternative around vocational learning, might take a different route. And we clearly have very high tuition fees, but all students do have access to the financial support that Claire outlined earlier, with all the caveats about whether or not they want to take it and the influence that has on the choices they make about institutional type and course type. So, what are the strengths of the national approach? And this is not to say that England's got it all right, but I think that those high rates of continuation show us something that make it interesting and worth thinking about. That there's no point expanding the diversity of the student population if then there's sort of leaking out of the system, as showed in the model of at each transition stage more students leave. So I think the strengths which I want to outline are that there's a clear and widely accepted definition of student success, and also that's connected to very explicit target groups, so students from particular underrepresented groups that institutions are charged with ensuring have equalised or attempting to equalise rates of completion. There are some policies which are deliberately in place to improve retention and success, which kind of work together, and these relate to institutional funding, not to student funding, but institutional funding, looking at the quality of teaching and learning, and providing that information to students. I'm not sure students always use the information, but there's a very explicit commitment to putting that kind of information in the public domain. And that's connected then to the third point there about institutional performance being measured and that information being in the public domain. So I'm not sure that, as I say, students are particularly using the information, but there's a huge kind of sense of accountability and sometimes detrimentally around league tables and performance, so the sorts of things that David was talking about earlier. And what I think comes out of this is that the policy mix really does encourage institutional responsibility for student success. And I think that's also then subsequently been underpinned by a commitment to developing an evidence base, so that in England the research evidence is comparatively well developed around improving retention and success. That doesn't mean we've got all the answers, but I think compared to other European countries, there's been quite an investment in that process of understanding the issues. So the first point then was around definitions, and as part of the case study that I did on England, I undertook a set of interviews with different stakeholders across the higher education sector in England and in 2015. And everyone is really in harmony about what success means. So there are these two definitions which you can see on the screen about the completion rate and the continuation rate, which come from the Higher Education Funding Council, and everyone kind of signs up to them and doesn't really question them. Whereas in other countries, different groups were much more likely to put forward their own definitions of what continuation or completion or success is. Through the interviews and more generally, if you ask people about success, they might then say, but it would also include, and want to extend and add to it. But there's this very sort of clear understanding of the measures that are used, and whether that's good or bad is arguable, but I think it gives everyone a common goal that they're aiming to, and I don't think that means you should exclude other definitions of success, but I think it's an interesting starting point. These haven't really been contested. More recently, though, they have been extended, so different definitions of success have been introduced by the Higher Education Funding Council, which no longer exists. But in 2013, they started saying, well, what is success? Because we were starting to talk about things beyond continuation and completion. So four aspects of success were defined, and I think there's still ongoing discussion now about extending that list further. So the first is about achieving a degree. So do students from all backgrounds equally achieve a degree? Are they equally likely to achieve a degree? Are they equally likely to achieve a good degree? So are they equally likely to come up are attainment levels similar? And that's been a real issue of concern currently around the differential rates of attainment. So students from lower socioeconomic groups, older students from minority groups in particular, are less likely to get a first or a 2-1, so the higher degree classifications, they're more likely to come out with a lower degree. And of course that then connects into those next two outcomes around employment. So if you haven't got a good degree, and various other factors, then are you also going into employment? And we know that particularly in such a marketized context as England, students are going into higher education to get a job. So that's one of the measures of success. And then the fourth measure there, which is perhaps is becoming more dominant at the moment, is about not just do students get a job or do graduates get a job, but do they get a graduate job? So are they getting the graduate salary and using the skills that they've learned through, or they've gained through their higher education experience? And those extended definitions of success are playing through some of the policies which I want to talk about. But when these definitions were proposed in 2013 and the subsequent analysis that informed them, it showed that all the groups that under-participate in higher education, or are underrepresented rather, also have less good outcomes against all of those four indicators. So that really sets the scene for improving student retention and success in higher education. I think the other thing which is interesting is that we have very clearly defined, although they haven't always been, target groups for what we would call widening participation. So I haven't really talked about that widening access side of it, but there's been for 20 years there's been a commitment to diversifying who participates, and now we're at the point of having really clear definitions of who those target groups are. There's a little bit more dispute about those, but I think that they really strongly exist, and that does then focus institutional action on the particular groups of students. So those groups are students from deprived areas, which is based on the index of multiple deprivation. So this is a geographical measure that takes into account a basket of indicators of deprivation. Then there's another geographical measure, which is the students from low participation areas. And this is probably it's the one that the measure that's been in place the longest, but it's probably the most contested, because it doesn't always work in some geographical areas. But again, it takes account of, it looks at the qualifications and who participates in higher education and who doesn't. So it gives you whether you're overrepresented or underrepresented in those areas. And it's based on the postcode. So you can put in your postcode of your house and see whether most people in your street go to higher education, or if they're young people, or whether most people don't, and so on and so forth. So it gives you another indicator. Both of those geographical indicators are quite useful because it allows targeted interventions based on geographical areas. The other target groups then are around minority groups. Generally, the minority groups are overrepresented in participation, but have much less good success rates against those 4 indicators that I identified. Another target group are mature students. We define mature students as over the age of 21 on entry, which is not very mature, but that's the definition. And then disabled students, and perhaps the newest group, or the newest category, is care leavers. So young people who've been looked after by the state were identified as having particularly low rates of participation, and so became a target group. So most institutions have now taken action to improve the participation and success of care leavers in higher education. But those groups have now been kind of formalised and put into policy, into one of the policy tools I want to talk about. Broadly, though, I think what makes England's context, or what makes it an effective context for improving student retention and success, is partly about the policy alignment. So, as Claire said this morning, the funding follows the student, and that's really explicit with tuition fees. And a rather cruel irony, perhaps, about the introduction of tuition fees is that it has really focused higher education institutions' minds on students, which you might have hoped they were focused on before. But I think it's helped to redress some of the imbalance between research income and prestige, which are clearly important for the league tables, which David talked about, and the core business, the majority of higher education institutions, which is educating undergraduate students. So the funding follows students, and if they leave at any point, then they don't receive that money. And so that's really been an important driver to influence what institutions do. The second thing is, though, that there's been a growing emphasis on the quality of teaching and learning, and I want to talk a little bit about the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, about how that's embedded those target groups into the metrics, so has brought widening participation away from some of the fringe activity of institutions and into the core business of learning and teaching. And then we have a new regulator for higher education, the Office for Students, and so all institutions now have to, as a condition of registration, have to produce an access and participation plan. And again, I think that's been a really strong driver, which I'll talk about. And then that's reinforced by this publication of public publication of information about the performance of all institutions, and then that gets kind of taken and fed into league tables, and there are all sorts of problems with league tables, but I think that it again raises diversity and success in the minds of higher education leaders, which is probably a good thing. And the final point then is around this role of research and evidence, which has underpinned the work. So access and participation plans are perhaps the largest policy tool in the armoury of widening participation practitioners that allows us to have some leverage within institutions. So access and participation plans really are intended to set out how institutions will improve the participation, the success, that's the continuation, completion and attainment, and the progression into employment of students from those target underrepresented groups that I identified. And this year, they had to produce a 5-year plan, and the first task was to assess their performance against each of those target groups across the different life cycle stages. And the Office for Students was really taking no prisoners. Institutions absolutely had to prioritise all areas when they had any area of underrepresentation or poorer performance, not equal to the majority of students. They then had to include their plans for what they're going to do about it, so how they're going to address it. They then had to produce challenging targets, so previously institutions have said they would stay the same or increase it by 0.1% or something, but they've been really forced to create challenging targets. And then they have to provide information about their investment to deliver the plan, and that investment is crucial. Part of the arrangement or deal for charging higher tuition fees above £6,000 is that they invest quite a significant proportion in their widening participation work, so in their access, their retention, their attainment and their progression work. And previously a lot of that's gone into financial support for individual students, but there's recognition that in and of itself doesn't always achieve retention and success goals, that it's more effectively spent on activities that improve the experience or provide support more directly to students. And finally, institutions have had to talk about how they're going to evaluate their approach. So that's about proving what works and adding to that evidence base. And I read something that, I was looking up the data again this morning, something like 97% of higher education institutions have had some level of sanctions placed on their registration this year. And the largest number of those have been around their access and participation plans. So suddenly our regulator has quite a lot of teeth when it comes to access and success. I'm not sure if it's the way you choose it, but as I say, it's given much more power and voice to this kind of work in higher education institutions in England. So this is just a snapshot from one institution that I've been working with, where they analysed their data in relation to the target groups that you can see down on the side and across the student life cycle that you can see across the top. And even if they had very small gaps, they had to make it a target group. So there were only 3 areas where they didn't have to make it a target. That was around access of disabled students, which was around about 10% of students in their intake. It was around the progression, so into employment of mature students, and it was around the progression of care leavers. Where it says KPM1, those are national performance targets that they're contributing to. So the only one they're not contributing to is around access to elite institutions, as this is not an elite institution. So this is the kind of level of scrutiny that institutions were involved in doing, were required to undertake. I'm working with another institution where they produced all this sort of data that underpins this, and they were told it wasn't good enough. They had to go back and do it and go down to more fine grain level. So there's really a lot of national pressure on institutions to put widening participation and student retention and success centre stage. The second sort of policy tool, which is quite controversial, is the teaching excellence and student outcomes framework, which was not predominantly designed to improve student retention and success, but is part of the quality framework that's being kind of extended and developed in the whole of the UK at the moment. So this is not just about England. And this was really about trying to assess the quality of learning and teaching, and it results in a very simplistic award of gold, silver or bronze. But what's important, I think, is that this has really placed emphasis on positive outcomes for all students. And so it uses a series of metrics to assess institutions' initial position, whether they're gold, silver or bronze. And then there's quite extensive narrative statements, so 15 pages of text, where institutions make the case about what they're doing around learning and teaching. All of those numeric indicators break it down by the majority of those target groups. Care leavers are not broken down because they're such a comparatively small group. And so then you start to see how institutions are doing in relation to all of their target groups. And at the moment, we've been there's been a pilot at the subject level as well. So initially it's been at institutional level, and then that's potentially drilling down to subject. So what I think that starts to do is really encourages academic staff, teaching staff, to have conversations about learning and teaching. So it's part of that equalisation of research versus learning and teaching. But it also puts student diversity at the heart of those conversations. And so, again, that's, I think, has been quite powerful and in helping to raise awareness of some of those differential outcomes for different student groups, and to have those conversations around how learning and teaching addresses those challenges, rather than it's a problem with students and we just need to kind of get the right students or somehow fix them. If we could just recruit the right ones, it would all be fine, wouldn't it? But like I say, we don't have that luxury. That's a little diagram of the model, but I don't think we need that. So the other part of it is, because there are these shared and widely accepted definitions of success, this has really facilitated measurement. So institutions must report a lot of their data to the Higher Education Statistics Agency. And so this goes into the public domain and then is used to create publicly available information. But what I think has been important is there's been recognition that different institutions have different subject mixes, different entry requirements, and different student demographics. So the Higher Education Statistics Agency has created a benchmark. So taking into account all of those characteristics of the institution and their students, what would you expect their performance to be? So in relation to this, what do we expect their performance to be for continuation from first year to second year of study? And so that benchmark, and sorry, that says annual target, and annual achievement is published annually. And this is used by the press to create those league tables. And it's up to you whether you think they're useful or not. It all depends which variables are included in the league tables. So you can see here's a snapshot from, I don't know if you can read it, but this is the most recent data that was available. And this relates to all students in higher education. So you can see that in the column that's called benchmark, so that's sort of third from the right-hand side, that's what institutions should be aspiring to. And then the next column to the left is actually what the different institutions achieved. And you can see that some of them are doing better than others. So Aston University stands out as doing particularly well, that their benchmark was for 6.2% of students to no longer to be in higher education, and they actually achieved 2.8%. Similarly, the poor old University of Bolton down here, their target was 10.8%, so it was a higher target because of the subject mix and students that enter their institution, but in this particular year, they achieved 15.4%, so they've been flagged there as having a negative. And similar for the University of Bedfordshire, which is actually a higher difference, I think. Anyway, so you can see how this data is available, and this really does help hold institutions to account. And then you've got similar data, which is shown here, which is for students from low participation neighbourhoods. So you can't really tell from this, but this is taken from a different table, and this gives them their target, the benchmark for students from the low participation neighbourhoods, from the lowest two quintiles, and then that gives their performance against that. And that's published every year. So I think that national policy mix really then promotes this institutional responsibility. I think what the literature shows us is that it's about institutions that can make a difference. It's not about state policy, and it's not about changing the students before they come in, and just making sure we choose the right ones. So that we've got a system where funding follows the student. We're starting to move towards a teaching quality system that actually looks at the differential experiences and outcomes of students from diverse backgrounds. We've got this explicit commitment to action through the access and participation plans, which then holds institutions accountable. They're also held accountable through the majority of that information being in the public domain. So in other countries, there seems to be much more stuff that's kind of hidden away and not shared publicly. And the final point, which I haven't really talked about, is that there's a commitment to the evidence base. So something called the Evidence Impact Exchange, which has just been renamed as the Transforming Access and Student Opportunities or something. I'm not even sure how you say that, TASO. But the point is that there's this national commitment to creating an evidence base to find out what works. And that's, I guess, is reinforced as well through the access and participation plans. So I'll skip the next slide, but the question is then, what are institutions doing? So if we say it's all about institutions, or I'm arguing that the English context, has created an environment that's made institutions want to improve retention and success, particularly students from diverse backgrounds, then what are they doing? And I want to suggest here that there's a kind of a maturity model. So in the first generation of work, we were looking at retention. We were looking at holding on to students who might otherwise have left the system. And then we were very much focusing on fixing up individual students through kind of bolt-on interventions, so activities that would identify them, target them, and do something to make them better able to stay within the higher education system as it was. And then we moved to this wider concept of success. So it wasn't just about looking at students who might leak out at the bottom, but it was about looking at success more generally and hoping to improve the success of all students, so that students who might be achieving a certain level might be able to do better, and so on and so forth. And I think what was really important in this work was around looking at the academic learning experience and recognising that students' engagement and belonging in their academic subject of study was important, and that was contributing to their fit and commitment and their ability to thrive and prosper in higher education. So a lot of the work I've been doing over the last few years has really been focusing on that aspect of learning and teaching, changing and looking at the curricula and the pedagogy and assessment, so that we bring as much as possible into the academic experience, and remember that students from many of these kind of diverse backgrounds don't have the opportunity to participate in all those extracurricular activities or support activities, that we have to bring it into the curriculum, because that's the place where those students are actually present. And then we're kind of moving on to this third generation at the moment, this whole institutional approach, where we've started to recognise that we need to go beyond that and look at the whole of the student's lived experience, and we need to involve staff from across the institution. So we need to have cross-institutional commitment. We need to look at the role of all parts of the institution and really creating a much more inclusive learning environment, but wider student experience. And much of the work I've been doing at the moment has been really looking at how you engage those students who come onto campus, do their classes and then leave, and then possibly end up with less good graduate outcomes in terms of things like employment, because they're not participating in that wider experience, which is part of the things which contribute to getting those graduate jobs. Okay, 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So some of this work has been informed by the What Works Student Retention and Success project, which I was involved in, which Christina talked about. I don't want to talk about that too much, but this has been really influential, I think, in terms of bringing that discussion into what institutions can do and bringing learning and teaching into the heart of improving student retention and success. And then more recently, we've been looking at this idea about the whole institution approach and recognising that it's not just about that academic experience, that we need to look at students' whole lived experience. And so understanding that there needs to be that institutional commitment to student retention and success, and then we have to have higher education organised so that the policies, processes and financial and staff resources are all committed to the success of students, and that's underpinned by a culture so that the practices of staff and students value diversity and teach for diversity. So there's still quite a traditional mindset amongst lots of staff around the kind of people who should be in higher education, how students should participate and what they should do. And so really challenging those notions about the contents of the curriculum and the expectations that we should have of contemporary students, because the other sort of side of the financial context of England is that the majority of students are also working part-time, so they're not necessarily having the traditional student experience which staff sometimes expect them to have. So we need to change cultures and values. And that's been really important, for example, in relation to improving the attainment of minority students. So actually challenging what we teach and how we teach and the expectations and the transparency about higher education. And that work then has to be underpinned by data and evidence and research, and really a very much more emphasis on a coordinated and consistent approach across the institution. I just had some sort of examples of things which institutions have been doing, and there's a huge long list there, and some of them I've already talked about. But I think what we've seen over the last sort of 10 or 15 years is a move towards institutions looking at their learning and teaching and the core academic experience and embedding much more of those activities into the curriculum, rather than hoping that students will either know what to do because the knowledge comes from their family, or that they'll go off and find out what they need to do by kind of tapping into additional services around the institution. There's also been an emphasis on raising the status of teaching, and also improving the teaching qualifications and, crucially, the teaching expertise of academic staff within institutions. There's still an imbalance between research and teaching, but there's been much greater emphasis on that. There's much more move towards things like personal tutoring and trying to create personal relationships between staff and students. So in a mass higher education, students still feel like they're known. And that's partly done as well through much more kind of active student-centered learning and teaching activities. There's huge amounts of stuff going on in institutions, but that's just a kind of a snapshot there, so I better get to this last slide and conclude. So it seems to me that achieving national success is more likely when there's national commitment that results in a shared definition and policy alignment and the measurement of institutional performance. And this really kind of encourages or requires higher education institutions to take responsibility for the success of students from all backgrounds, and not just to say that enough students are getting through their system. And this is really helped when the institutional approach is informed by research and evaluation, and really sort of involves students in mainstream activities. That's been a key part of what we've been doing, trying to make sure that they're not additional extras that students opt into, but things which are delivered to all students through a kind of inclusive curriculum. But increasingly we're seeing the importance of aligning other parts of the institutional student experience, which is probably quite different to the Portuguese student experience, but I don't know. But trying to align all of those things towards that common goal of improving success in higher education and beyond. So increasingly careers services are now starting to think about how they work with and equalise the graduate outcomes of students from diverse backgrounds. Thank you very much for listening.